If you've been watching my channel, you may have noticed I didn't post last week. It was because I was moving, and so now I am here coming at you from my new apartment, and I'm super excited to continue bringing you videos. So what I did last week, instead of posting a new video, was I posted a poll because I really wanted to understand what video you all would like to see next, and by far the topic that got the most votes was how to write a synopsis. So it's clear that some of you watching have been struggling with your synopsis, and I totally understand why. The synopsis is a document that causes writers a lot of stress. First thing I want to tell you is that, quite honestly, the synopsis is not all that important. So while I'm going to help you today in approaching your synopsis and giving you some tips for writing one, you need to know there are really only two scenarios in which you're really going to come across a synopsis. The first is if you are reaching out to literary agents because you want to get your novel published and they request a synopsis as part of the query materials. It's important to note, however, that not all agents actually request a synopsis, so you really only need to provide one if it is explicitly asked for. The second situation in which you will be requiring a synopsis is if you are already in a working relationship with a publisher or an editor at a publishing house and they specifically request a synopsis for your next book to then determine if they want to continue working with you on that project as well as the one that you had already worked on together. So there are really only a few scenarios in which you really need to think about your synopsis, but today I'm going to offer you the top do's and don'ts for writing a synopsis for a novel. Hopefully this makes the process a little bit easier and makes the task of writing the synopsis feel less daunting. If you find this type of content helpful or you're working on a novel, I recommend subscribing to my channel. I talk a lot about how to get a literary agent, how to get published, and how to just strengthen your writing overall. So with that, let's dive right in. The first thing I need to cover today is what is a synopsis versus a blurb. These two items get confused often, and they serve very different purposes, and they're stylized in very specific ways, so it's critical that you understand the difference. Today, we are talking about a synopsis. So think of this synopsis as if you were telling a friend every single bit about your novel from beginning to end. You were recapping it in its entirety, and they had never read it. That's really what the synopsis does. It gives the detailed play-by-play major events of the novel and reveals the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. The blurb, on the other hand, is really more like a movie trailer. So this is akin to the copy that you would see on the back cover of a hardcover book if you're in the bookstore and you're reading the description determining if you want to buy the book or not. That's a blurb. It really just gives you a teaser, a preview of what is inside the novel to entice the reader to then purchase it and read the whole thing. It does not give away the entire events of the plot. It really just gives a taste. So now that we've cleared up the difference between the synopsis and the blurb, let's start with the first do of writing a synopsis. It is to start with the inciting action of the story. So in the synopsis, you have to summarize your entire complex story in a very limited space. Typically, the synopsis is between 1 to 3 pages, and your novel is presumably hundreds of pages. So you really need to be high level here, and you really need to get straight to the point. So start with the point of action that really incites the events of the novel. To illustrate this, I'm going to use an example synopsis that I found on SparkNotes about The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. So this is really going to help illustrate each point, and you'll see how the synopsis should sound and also what it should not sound like. So a great example of starting a synopsis with an inciting incident is: Star Carter, a 16-year-old black girl, attends a party in her neighborhood, Garden Heights. So we immediately see the first action of the story, and then we understand that, something's gonna happen at that party that then unravels the rest of the plot from there. So again, get right to the point with that first inciting incident. The first don't of writing a synopsis is you don't want to start with an overview or a summary type sentence. So one tip that I'll give you is, if you find yourself writing about your novel and you're using the title to describe it, that kind of will give you an indication that you are veering into this overview or summary territory. Resist the urge to talk about the novel's themes or talk about its overarching message in the synopsis, because that's not really the place to do so. Remember, you're not using the synopsis to pitch the book. You are really using it to provide a very tactical, a very practical overview of your novel's events and how the story unravels. So an example, again, from The Hate You Give of what not to do in the synopsis would be: The Hate You Give explores the effects of racism, police brutality, and activism. While it's really interesting to understand the story's themes, and while that's very important when you're overall communicating either with an agent or a publisher, the synopsis is not the place for that type of discussion or that type of sentence. It's just out of place, because again, the synopsis should really just be boom, 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 action, 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 and you don't need to provide any of this extraneous context about the novel or an editorial discussion of it. The next do of a synopsis is that you want to make sure you are covering all the major plot events and all of the storylines. So if your novel has multiple character points of view, you'll want to make sure you are giving all of those different characters and showing the agent or the publisher how those character storylines play out. So one of the biggest mistakes I see writers make when I'm editing or assessing a synopsis is it feels like there's large gaps in the story. So you need to make sure that you are bridging those gaps as much as possible and showing the agent or the publisher exactly how the events connect to one another and how the developments are sequentially ordered. We need to understand, from a high level at least, how each of those developments proceeds from the previous one. So an example again would be, Star runs into her childhood best friend, Khalil Harris, whom she hasn't seen in a long time. Gunshots from a gang fight interrupt the party, and Khalil offers to take Star home. The inciting incident of the plot that we learned from the first sentence of the synopsis is that Star goes to a party, and then we immediately learn what happens at that party that then propels all the events of the novel. They hear gunshots. The agent or publisher reading this will understand logically how we go from one to the next. A big don't with synopsis writing is you don't want to go into excessive detail. You are distilling your hundreds of pages down into 1 to 3 pages, and you really don't have room to provide all of the color about all of the secondary characters, maybe some subplots. They're not all going to make it into your synopsis, and that is perfectly okay. Resist the urge to describe minute details in the plot, because you really need to keep it high level. Describing each and every scene or each and every conversation in detail is really going to bog down the synopsis and make it too long. Let's illustrate this with an example. Star runs into her childhood best friend, Khalil Harris, whom she hasn't seen in a long time. That was the same sentence from the prior example. It's showing an action that happens, Star meeting Khalil, so that's really great to keep in the synopsis. Khalil is handsome, with dimples that keep him from looking tough. She asks why she hasn't seen him around, and Khalil replies that he's been busy. So here are 2 details that don't really need to be in the synopsis document. First, we are learning what Khalil looks like. So while this is interesting and knowing what his appearance is helps the reader picture him in their mind, it's really not essential to the developments of the plot that he has dimples, so you don't need to put it in the synopsis. Secondly, here they are talking about the conversation between Star and Khalil, the content of what they were discussing. In this case, the actual words that were exchanged doesn't seem to really affect what happens, which is that they hear gunshots. So again, that's not really necessary to include the content of their conversation. Now, in your story, there may be a conversation that happens where it's really important to mention what one character says to another, but in some cases, it's really not necessary to dive into the details of the conversation. So my last do for synopsis writing is you do want to give away the ending. This may feel counterintuitive because in most cases, you want to save the ending and you want the reader to experience it for themselves, but remember that the agent or the publisher has specifically requested the synopsis document because they want to see exactly how the story unfolds, and they need to be able to assess the ending to determine if they want to work on that project and if they think the story is really effective and feasible. So don't beat around the bush, don't make it vague, don't use ellipses or anything like that. Just disclose the information about exactly what happens at the end. So an example here would be, Star names several real-life victims of police violence and Emmett Till. She vows to Khalil that she will never forget and never give up. So here we learn that Star is making some kind of statement, and we learn the content of that statement. I also really like this synopsis closing line because it gives us a sense of the sentiment that the novel ends on. We learn that Star has committed to persevering. There's a little bit of optimism at the end. So in your synopsis, see if you can describe the closing events of the novel while giving the person reading the synopsis a taste of what that closing feeling is. Is there closure at the end of the novel? Or is it a novel that is more ambiguous in its ending and we don't really know what happens to the characters? That is all information that really helps the agent and publisher understand the lingering effects that your novel will have on the reader. So a don't to think about when you're writing those closing lines of your synopsis is you don't want to include any editorial commentary. Again, the synopsis is meant to be a straightforward, practical, and quite frankly, bland document. It is not the most beautifully written piece. It is not meant to be creatively portrayed. It's really meant to be very practical. Your query letter is actually a much better place for you to pitch the value of your book and why readers are going to love it. So don't feel compelled or don't feel like you have to do that in the synopsis. So an example of this editorial commentary would be something like, underlying the traumatic events of The Hate U Give is the cyclical nature of racialized poverty, and through Starr's deepening understanding of it, we see how this intergenerational cycle is difficult to break. So it's really interesting, again, to talk about the themes of the novel and its overarching message, but it's not necessary in the synopsis document because you will be discussing those messages and themes with the agent and publisher via a verbal pitch or your query letter. So another question that I get asked all the time is about the synopsis length, and I gave you the range of 1 to 3 pages. What I really recommend doing is having 2 versions of your synopsis. A long version, which could be 2 to 3 pages, and the short version should absolutely be just 1 single page. The reason being that some agents in particular will request a synopsis, but they won't say how long it needs to be, in which case you can send them that longer version that gives a little bit more detail and color. But if the agent specifically requests a 1-page synopsis, you need to ensure it is on 1 page. And if they mention if it's single or double spaced and font size, anything like that, you need to make sure you're following their guidelines. I hope these tips help you tackle that synopsis document that I know can be a struggle, and I hope that it helps you understand better what the synopsis document is and what it isn't. Let me know in the comments below if there are any other questions you have about synopses that I can help with, and I would love to get back to you and help you troubleshoot those issues. If you are in the process of reaching out to literary agents, I recommend checking out my video on how to get a literary agent. I talk about what specific qualities literary agents are looking for in authors that they offer representation to. And if this type of content is helpful to you and you're working on a book or aspiring to become an author, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you around for my future videos. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.